The Russo-Japanese War, 8 February 1904 to 5 September 1905, was fought between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan over rival imperial ambitions in Manchuria and the Korean Empire. The major land battles of the war were fought on the Liaodong Peninsula and near Mukden in southern Manchuria, with naval battles taking place in the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan. Russia had pursued an expansionist policy in Siberia and the Far East since the reign of Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century. At the end of the First Sino-Japanese War, the Treaty of Shimonoseki of 1895 had ceded the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur to Japan before the Triple Intervention, in which Russia, Germany, and France forced Japan to relinquish its claim. Japan feared that Russia would impede its plans to establish a sphere of influence in mainland Asia, especially as Russia built the Trans-Siberian Railroad, began making inroads in Korea, and acquired a lease of the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur from China in 1898. Japan signed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1902 and began offering to recognize Russia's dominance in Manchuria in exchange for recognition of Korea as part of Japan's sphere of influence. However, this was rejected by Russia. After negotiations broke down, Japan opened hostilities in a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur on 9 February, OS 27 January, 1904. Both sides declared war, and Japanese troops landed in Korea, crossed the Yalu River into Manchuria in May, and landed more forces on the Liaodong Peninsula. In August, the Japanese laid siege to Port Arthur, which eventually fell in January 1905. In March 1905, Japanese troops took Mukden, the Manchurian capital, after heavy fighting. The Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed over 7 months and 18,000 nautical miles, or 33,000 kilometers, from the Baltic Sea, arrived in the region in May and was intercepted and destroyed by the Japanese combined fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. The war was concluded with the Treaty of Portsmouth, 5 September, OS 23 August, 1905, mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. The treaty recognized Japanese interests in Korea and awarded to Japan Russia's lease on the Liaodong Peninsula, control of the Russian-built South Manchurian Railway, and the southern half of the island of Sakhalin, or Karafuto. The complete military victory of an Asian and non-Western nation over a European and Western power surprised international observers and transformed the global balance of power, with the Empire of Japan emerging as a great power and the Russian Empire declining in prestige among the European powers. Russia's incurrence of substantial casualties and losses for a cause which resulted in a humiliating defeat contributed to internal unrest, culminating in the 1905 Russian Revolution, during which the Russian autocracy was forced to make concessions. More widely, however, Japan's win effectively damaged the credibility of European dominance in Asia.
Battle of Tsushima. After a stopover of several weeks at the minor port of Nasi Bay, Madagascar, that had been reluctantly allowed by neutral France in order not to jeopardize its relations with its Russian ally, the Russian Baltic Fleet proceeded to Cam Ranh Bay in French Indochina, passing on its way through the Singapore Strait between 7 and 10 April 1905. The fleet finally reached the Sea of Japan in May 1905. The logistics of such an undertaking in the age of coal power was astounding. The squadron required approximately 500,000 tons of coal to complete the journey, yet by international law, it was not allowed to call at neutral ports, forcing the Russian authorities to acquire a large fleet of colliers to supply the fleet at sea. The weight of the ship's stores needed for such a long journey was to be another major problem. The Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, the renamed Baltic Fleet, sailed 18,000 nautical miles, 33,000 kilometers, to relieve Port Arthur, only to hear the demoralizing news that Port Arthur had fallen while it was still at Madagascar. Admiral Rozhesvinsky's only hope now was to reach the port of Vladivostok. There were 3 routes to Vladivostok, with the shortest and most direct passing through Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan. However, this was also the most dangerous route as it passed between the Japanese home islands and the Japanese naval bases in Korea. Admiral Togo was aware of Russian progress and understood that, with the fall of Port Arthur, the 2nd and 3rd Pacific Squadrons would try to reach the only other Russian port in the Far East, Vladivostok. Battle plans were laid down, and ships were repaired and refitted to intercept the Russian fleet. The Japanese combined fleet, which had originally consisted of 6 battleships, was now down to 4 battleships and 1 second-class battleship. 2 had been lost to mines, but still retained its cruisers, destroyers, and torpedo boats. The Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron contained 8 battleships, including 4 new battleships of the Borodino class, as well as cruisers, destroyers, and other auxiliaries, for a total of 38 ships. By the end of May, the 2nd Pacific Squadron was on the last leg of its journey to Vladivostok, taking the shorter, riskier route between Korea and Japan and traveling at night to avoid discovery. Unfortunately for the Russians, while in compliance with the rules of war, the 2 trailing hospital ships had continued to burn their lights, which were spotted by the Japanese armed merchant cruiser Sanano Maru. Wireless communication was used to inform Togo's headquarters, where the combined fleet was immediately ordered to sortie. Still receiving reports from scouting forces, the Japanese were able to position their fleet to cross the T of the Russian fleet. The Japanese engaged the Russians in the Tsushima Straits on 27-28 May 1905. The Russian fleet was virtually annihilated, losing 8 battleships, numerous smaller vessels, and more than 5,000 men, while the Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats and 116 men. Only 3 Russian vessels escaped to Vladivostok, while 6 others were interned in neutral ports. After the Battle of Tsushima, a combined Japanese Army and Navy operation, commanded by Admiral Kataoka Shichihiro, occupied Sakhalin Island to force the Russians into suing for peace.
Pressure from the people. The British Japanologist Richard Story wrote that the biggest misconception about Japan and the West was that the Japanese people were the docile instruments of the elite, when in fact, much of the pressure for Japan's wars from 1894 to 1941 came from the ordinary people, who demanded a tough foreign policy and tended to engage in riots and assassination when foreign policy was perceived to be pusillanimous. Though the Meiji oligarchy refused to allow liberal democracy, they did seek to appropriate some of the demands of the People's Rights Movement by allowing an elected imperial diet in 1890, with limited powers and an equally limited franchise, and by pursuing an aggressive foreign policy towards Korea. In 1884, Japan had encouraged a coup in the Kingdom of Korea by a pro-Japanese reformist faction, which led to the conservative government calling upon China for help, leading to a clash between Chinese and Japanese soldiers in Seoul. At the time, Tokyo did not feel ready to risk a war with China, and the crisis was ended by the Convention of Tientsin, which left Korea more strongly in the Chinese sphere of influence, though it did give the Japanese the right to intervene in Korea. All through the 1880s and early 1990s, the government in Tokyo was regularly criticized for not being aggressive enough in Korea, leading Japanese historian Masao Maruyama to write, "Just as Japan was subject to pressure from the great powers, so she would apply pressure to still weaker countries, a clear case of the transfer psychology." In this regard, it is significant that ever since the Meiji period, demands for a tough foreign policy have come from the common people, that is, from those who are at the receiving end of oppression at home. Russian Eastern expansion. Tsarist Russia, as a major imperial power, had ambitions in the East. By the 1890s, it had extended its realm across Central Asia to Afghanistan, absorbing local states in the process. The Russian Empire stretched from Poland in the west to the Kamchatka Peninsula in the east. With its construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway to the port of Vladivostok, Russia hoped to further consolidate its influence and presence in the region. In the Tsushima incident of 1861, Russia directly assaulted Japanese territory. First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. The first major war the Empire of Japan fought following the Meiji Restoration was against China from 1894 to 1895. The war revolved around the issue of control and influence over Korea under the rule of the Joseon dynasty. From the 1880s onward, there had been vigorous competition for influence in Korea between China and Japan. The Korean court was prone to factionalism, and at the time was badly divided between a reformist camp that was pro-Japanese and a more conservative faction that was pro-Chinese. In 1884, a pro-Japanese coup attempt was put down by Chinese troops, and a residency under General Yuan Shikai was established in Seoul. A peasant rebellion led by the Tonghak religious movement led to a request by the Korean government for the Qing dynasty to send in troops to stabilize the country. The Empire of Japan responded by sending their own force to Korea to crush the Tonghak and installed a puppet government in Seoul. China objected, and war ensued. Hostilities proved brief, with Japanese ground troops routing Chinese forces on the Liaodong Peninsula and nearly destroying the Chinese Beiyang fleet in the Battle of the Yalu River. Japan and China signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which ceded the Liaodong Peninsula and the island of Taiwan to Japan. After the peace treaty, Russia, Germany, and France forced Japan to withdraw from the Liaodong Peninsula. The leaders of Japan did not feel that they possessed the strength to resist the combined might of Russia, Germany, and France, and so gave in to the ultimatum. At the same time, the Japanese did not abandon their attempts to force Korea into the Japanese sphere of influence. On October 8, 1895, Queen Min of Korea, the leader of the anti-Japanese and pro-Chinese faction at the Korean court, was murdered by Japanese agents within the halls of the Gyeongbokgung Palace, an act that backfired badly as it turned Korean public opinion against Japan. In early 1896, King Gojong of Korea fled to the Russian legation in Seoul, believing that his life was in danger from Japanese agents, and Russian influence in Korea started to predominate. In the aftermath of the flight of the king, a popular uprising overthrew the pro-Japanese government, and several cabinet ministers were lynched in the streets. In 1897, Russia occupied the Liaodong Peninsula, built the Port Arthur Fortress, and based the Russian Pacific Fleet in the port. Russia's acquisition of Port Arthur was primarily an anti-British move to counter the British occupation of Weihai Wei, but in Japan this was perceived as an anti-Japanese move. Germany occupied Jiaozhou Bay, built the Qingtao Fortress, and based the German East Asia Squadron in this port. Between 1897 and 1903, the Russians built the Chinese Eastern Railway in Manchuria. The Chinese Eastern Railroad was owned jointly by the Russian and Chinese governments, but the company's management was entirely Russian. The line was built to the Russian gauge, and Russian troops were stationed in Manchuria to protect rail traffic on the CER from bandit attacks. The headquarters of the CER company was located in the new Russian-built city of Harbin, the Moscow of the Orient. From 1897 onward, Manchuria, while still nominally part of the Great Qing Empire, started to resemble more and more a Russian province.
Russian encroachment. In December 1897, a Russian fleet appeared off Port Arthur. After 3 months, in 1898, China and Russia negotiated a convention by which China leased to Russia Port Arthur, Talyuan, and the surrounding waters. The two parties further agreed that the convention could be extended by mutual agreement. The Russians clearly expected such an extension, for they lost no time in occupying the territory and in fortifying Port Arthur, their sole warm-water port on the Pacific coast and of great strategic value. A year later, to consolidate their position, the Russians began to build a new railway from Harbin through Mukden to Port Arthur, the South Manchurian Railroad. The development of the railway became a contributory factor to the Boxer Rebellion when Boxer forces burned the railway stations. The Russians also began to make inroads into Korea. A large point of Russia's growing influence in Korea was Go-jung's internal exile to the Russian legation. A pro-Russian cabinet emerged in the Korean Empire. In 1901, Tsar Nicholas II told Prince Henry of Prussia, "I do not want to seize Korea, but under no circumstances can I allow Japan to become firmly established there. That will be a casus bellis." By 1898, they had acquired mining and forestry concessions near the Yalu and Tumen rivers, causing the Japanese much anxiety. Japan decided to attack before the Russians completed the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Boxer Rebellion. See also, Russian invasion of Manchuria. The Russians and the Japanese both contributed troops to the Eight-Nation Alliance sent in 1900 to quell the Boxer Rebellion and to relieve the international legations besieged in the Chinese capital, Beijing. Russia had already sent 177,000 soldiers to Manchuria, nominally to protect its railways under construction. Though the Qing Imperial Army and the Boxer rebels united to fight against the invasion, they were quickly overrun and ejected from Manchuria. After the Boxer Rebellion, 100,000 Russian soldiers were stationed in Manchuria. The Russian troops settled in, and despite assurances they would vacate the area after the crisis, by 1903, the Russians had not established a timetable for withdrawal and had actually strengthened their position in Manchuria. Troops of the Eight-Nation Alliance in 1900, left to right, Britain, United States, Australia, India, Germany, France, Austria-Hungary, Italy. Japan.
Pre-war negotiations. The Japanese statesman Ito Hirobumi started to negotiate with the Russians. He regarded Japan as too weak to evict the Russians militarily, so he proposed giving Russia control over Manchuria in exchange for Japanese control of northern Korea. Of the 5 Genro, elder statesmen, who made up the Meiji oligarchy, Ito Hirobumi and Count Inoue Kaoru opposed the idea of war against Russia on financial grounds, while Katsura Taro, Komura Jurotaro, and Field Marshal Yamagata Aritomo favored war. Meanwhile, Japan and Britain had signed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1902, the British seeking to restrict naval competition by keeping the Russian Pacific seaports of Vladivostok and Port Arthur from their full use. Japan's alliance with the British meant, in part, that if any nation allied itself with Russia during any war against Japan, then Britain would enter the war on Japan's side. Russia could no longer count on receiving help from either Germany or France without the danger of British involvement in the war. With such an alliance, Japan felt free to commence hostilities if necessary. The 1890s and 1900s marked the height of the Yellow Peril propaganda by the German government, and the German Emperor Wilhelm II, reigned 1888 to 1918, often wrote letters to his cousin, Emperor Nicholas II of Russia, praising him as the savior of the white race, and urging Russia forward in Asia. From November 1894 onward, Wilhelm had been writing letters praising Nicholas as Europe's defender from the Yellow Peril, assuring the Tsar that God himself had chosen Russia to defend Europe from the alleged Asian threat. On November 1, 1902, Wilhelm wrote to Nicholas that certain symptoms in the East seemed to show that Japan is becoming a rather restless customer, and it is evident to every unbiased mind that Korea must and will be Russian. Wilhelm ended his letter with the warning that Japan and China would soon unite against Europe, writing,
20 to 30 million Chinese, supported by a half-dozen Japanese divisions, led by competent, intrepid Japanese officers, full of hatred for Christianity, that is a vision of the future that cannot be contemplated without concern, and it is not impossible. On the contrary, it is the realization of the yellow peril, which I described a few years ago, and I was ridiculed by the majority of people for my graphic depiction of it. Your devoted friend and cousin, Willie, Admiral of the Atlantic. Wilhelm aggressively encouraged Russia's ambitions in Asia because France, Russia's closest ally since 1894, was less than supportive of Russian expansionism in Asia, and it was believed in Berlin that German support of Russia might break up the Franco-Russian alliance and lead to a new German-Russian alliance. This was especially the case as Germany had embarked on the Tirpitz Plan, and a policy of Weltpolitik from 1897 meant to challenge Britain's position as the world's leading power. Since Britain was allied to Japan, if Germany could manipulate Russia and Japan into going to war with each other, this in turn would allegedly lead to Russia turning towards Germany. Furthermore, Wilhelm believed if a Russian-German alliance emerged, France would be compelled to join it. He also hoped that having Russia pursue an expansionist policy in Asia would distract and keep Russia out of the Balkans, thus removing the main source of tension between Russia and Germany's ally, Austria-Hungary. During the war, Nicholas, who took at face value Wilhelm's Yellow Peril speeches and letters to Nicholas, placed much hope in German intervention on his side. More than once, Nicholas chose to continue the war out of the belief that the Kaiser would come to his aid. Despite previous assurances that Russia would completely withdraw from Manchuria, the forces it had sent to crush the Boxer Rebellion by April 8, 1903, that day passed with no reduction in Russian forces in that region. In Japan, university students demonstrated both against Russia and against their own government for not taking any action. On July 28, 1903, Kurino Shinchiro, the Japanese minister in St. Petersburg, was instructed to present his country's view opposing Russia's consolidation plans in Manchuria. On August 3, 1903, the Japanese minister handed in the following document to serve as the basis for further negotiations.
Mutual engagement to respect the independence and territorial integrity of the Chinese and Korean empires, and to maintain the principle of equal opportunity for the commerce and industry of all nations in those countries. Reciprocal recognition of Japan's preponderating interests in Korea and Russia's special interests in railway enterprises in Manchuria, and of the right of Japan to take in Korea and of Russia to take in Manchuria such measures as may be necessary for the protection of their respective interests as above defined, subject, however, to the provisions of Article 1 of this agreement. Reciprocal undertaking on the part of Russia and Japan not to impede development of those industrial and commercial activities, respectively, of Japan in Korea and of Russia in Manchuria, which are not inconsistent with the stipulations of Article 1 of this agreement. Additional engagement on the part of Russia not to impede the eventual extension of the Korean Railway into southern Manchuria so as to connect with the East China and Shanghai-Quan-Nuchuang lines. Reciprocal engagement that in case it is found necessary to send troops by Japan to Korea or by Russia to Manchuria for the purpose either of protecting the interests mentioned in Article 2 of this agreement or of suppressing insurrection or disorder calculated to create international complications, the troops so sent are in no case to exceed the actual number required and are to be forthwith recalled as soon as their missions are accomplished. Recognition on the part of Russia of the exclusive right of Japan to give advice and assistance in the interest of reform and good government in Korea, including necessary military assistance. This agreement to supplant
all previous arrangements between Japan and Russia respecting Korea. On 3 October 1903, the Russian minister to Japan, Roman Rosen, presented to the Japanese government the Russian counterproposal as the basis of negotiations, as follows: mutual engagement to respect the independence and territorial integrity of the Korean Empire, recognition by Russia of Japan's preponderating interests in Korea and of the right of Japan to give advice and assistance to Korea tending to improve the civil administration of the empire without infringing the stipulations of Article 1. Engagement on the part of Russia not to impede the commercial and industrial undertakings of Japan in Korea, nor to oppose any measures taken for the purpose of protecting them so long as such measures do not infringe the stipulations of Article 1. Recognition of the right of Japan to send for the same purpose troops to Korea with the knowledge of Russia, but their number not to exceed that actually required, and with the engagement on the part of Japan to recall such troops as soon as their mission is accomplished. Mutual engagement not to use any part of the territory of Korea for strategical purposes, nor to undertake on the coasts of Korea any military works capable of menacing the freedom of navigation in the Straits of Korea. Mutual engagement to consider that part of the territory of Korea lying to the north of the 39th parallel as a neutral zone, into which neither of the contracting parties shall introduce troops. Recognition by Japan of Manchuria and its littoral as in all respects outside her sphere of interest. This agreement to supplant all previous agreements between Russia and Japan respecting Korea. During the Russian-Japanese talks, the Japanese historian Hirono Yoshihiko noted, once negotiations commenced between Japan and Russia, Russia scaled back its demands and claims regarding Korea bit by bit, making a series of concessions that Japan regarded as serious compromises on Russia's part. The war might not have broken out had not the issues of Korea and Manchuria become linked because the Prime Minister of Japan, Katsura Taro, in office 1901 to 1906, decided if war did come, that Japan was more likely to have the support of the United States and Great Britain if the war could be presented as a struggle for free trade against the highly protectionist Russian Empire, in which case Manchuria, which was the larger market than Korea, was more likely to engage Anglo-American sympathies. Throughout the war, Japanese propaganda presented the recurring theme of Japan as a civilized power that supported free trade and would implicitly allow foreign businesses into the resource-rich region of Manchuria, versus Russia, the uncivilized power that was protectionist and wanted to keep the riches of Manchuria all to itself.
Emperor Gojong of Korea, king from 1864 to 1897 and emperor from 1897 to 1907, came to believe that the issue dividing Japan and Russia was Manchuria and chose to pursue a policy of neutrality as the best way of preserving Korean independence as the crisis mounted. In a series of reports to Beijing, Hu Weidai, the Chinese ambassador in St. Petersburg from July 1902 to September 1907, looked closely at whether a Russian or a Japanese victory would be favorable to China, and argued that the latter was preferable as he maintained a Japanese victory presented the better chance for China to regain sovereignty over Manchuria. In December 1903, China decided to remain neutral if war came, because though Japan was the only power capable of evicting Russia from Manchuria, the extent of Japanese ambitions in Manchuria was not clear to Beijing. Russian-Japanese negotiations then followed, although by early January 1904, the Japanese government had realized that Russia was not interested in settling the Manchurian or Korean issues. Instead, Russia's goal was buying time, via diplomacy, to further build up militarily. In December 1903, Wilhelm wrote in a marginal note on a diplomatic dispatch about his role in inflaming Russo-Japanese relations. Since 97, Cao, we have never left Russia in any doubt that we would cover her back in Europe in case she decided to pursue a bigger policy in the Far East that might lead to military complications with the aim of relieving our eastern border from the fearful pressure and threat of the massive Russian army.
whereupon Russia took Port Arthur and, trusting us, took her fleet out of the Baltic, thereby making herself vulnerable to us by sea. In Danzig 01 and Reval 02, the same assurance was given again, with result that entire Russian divisions from Poland and European Russia were and are being sent to the Far East. This would not have happened if our governments had not been in agreement. A recurring theme of Willem's letters to Nicholas was that Holy Russia had been chosen by God to save the entire white race from the Yellow Peril, and that Russia was entitled to annex all of Korea, Manchuria, and northern China up to Beijing. Willem went on to assure Nicholas that once Russia had defeated Japan, this would be a deadly blow to British diplomacy, and that the two emperors, the self-proclaimed Admiral of the Atlantic and the Admiral of the Pacific, would rule Eurasia together, making them able to challenge British sea power as the resources of Eurasia would make their empires immune to a British blockade, and thus allowing Germany and Russia to divide up the best of the British colonies in Asia between them. Nicholas had been prepared to compromise with Japan, but after receiving a letter from Willem attacking him as a coward for his willingness to compromise with the Japanese, who, Willem never ceasing reminding Nicholas, represented the Yellow Peril, for the sake of peace, became more obstinate. Willem had written to Nicholas stating that the question of Russian interests in Manchuria and Korea was beside the point, saying instead that it was a matter of Russia
undertaking the protection and defense of the white race, and with it, Christian civilization, against the yellow race. And whatever the Japs are determined to ensure the domination of the yellow race in East Asia, to put themselves at its head and organize and lead it into battle against the white race. That is the kernel of the situation. And therefore, there can be very little doubt about where the sympathies of all halfway intelligent Europeans should lie. England betrayed Europe's interests to America in a cowardly and shameful way over the Panama Canal question, so as to be left in peace by the Yankees. Will the Tsar likewise betray the interests of the white race to the yellow, as to be left in peace and not embarrass the Hague Tribunal too much?
When Nicholas replied that he still wanted peace, Wilhelm wrote back in a telegram, "You innocent angel," telling his advisors, "This is the language of an innocent angel, but not that of a white czar." Nevertheless, Tokyo believed that Russia was not serious about seeking a peaceful solution to the dispute. On 13 January 1904, Japan proposed a formula by which Manchuria would remain outside Japan's sphere of influence and, reciprocally, Korea outside Russia's. On 21 December 1903, the Kasura cabinet voted to go to war against Russia. By 4 February 1904, no formal reply had been received from St. Petersburg. On 6 February, the Japanese minister to Russia, Kurino Shinichiro, was recalled and Japan severed diplomatic relations with Russia. Potential diplomatic resolution of territorial concerns between Japan and Russia failed. Historians have argued that this directly resulted from the actions of Emperor Nicholas II. Crucially, Nicholas mismanaged his government. Although some scholars contend that the situation arose from the determination of Nicholas II to use the war against Japan to spark a revival in Russian patriotism, no historical evidence supports this claim. The Tsar's advisors did not support the war, foreseeing problems in transporting troops and supplies from European Russia to the east. The Tsar himself repeatedly delayed negotiations with the Japanese government as he believed that he was protected by God and the autocracy. The Japanese understanding of this can be seen in a telegram from Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs Komura to the Minister to Russia, in which he stated, "The Japanese government have at all times during the progress of the negotiations made it a special point to give prompt answers to all propositions of the Russian government. The negotiations have now been pending for no less than 4 months, and they have not yet reached a stage where the final issue can with certainty be predicted. In these circumstances, the Japanese government cannot but regard with grave concern the situation for which the delays in negotiations are largely responsible. Some scholars have suggested that Nicholas II dragged Japan into war intentionally, in hopes of reviving Russian nationalism. This notion conflicts with a comment made by Nicholas to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, saying there would be no war because he did not wish it. This does not reject the claim that Russia played an aggressive role in the East, which it did. Rather, it means that Russia unwisely calculated and supposed that Japan would not go to war against Russia's far larger and seemingly superior navy and army. Nicholas held the Japanese in contempt as yellow monkeys, and he took for granted that the Japanese would simply yield in the face of Russia's superior power, which thus explains his unwillingness to compromise. Evidence of Russia's false sense of security and superiority to Japan is seen by Russian reference to Japan's choosing war as a big mistake.
Status of combatants, Japan. Japan had conducted detailed studies of the Russian Far East and Manchuria prior to the war, and, as it was mandatory for Japanese officers to speak one foreign language, Japan had access to superior maps during the conflict. The Japanese army relied on conscription, introduced in 1873, to maintain its military strength and to provide a large army in times of war. This system of conscription gave Japan a large pool of reserves to draw upon. The active army and the first-line reserve, used to bring the active army to wartime strength, totaled 380,000 men. The second-line reserve contained 200,000, the conscript reserve a further 50,000, and the kokumin, akin to a national guard or militia, 220,000. This amounted to 850,000 trained troops available for service, in addition to 4,250,000 men in the untrained reserve. Immediately available to Japan on the declaration of war were 257,000 infantry, 11,000 cavalry, and 894 pieces of artillery. These figures were divided between the Imperial Guards Division, 12 regular divisions, 2 cavalry brigades, 2 artillery brigades, 13 reserve brigades, depot troops, and the garrison of Taiwan. A regular Japanese army contained 11,400 infantry, 430 cavalry, and 36 guns, the guns being organized into batteries of 6. Though another 4 divisions and 4 reserve brigades were formed in 1904, no further formations were created as the reserves were used to replace losses sustained in combat. Japanese reserves were given a full year of training before entering combat, though as the war progressed, this was reduced to 6 months due to high casualties. The Japanese army did not follow the European convention of implementing corps, thus there were no corps troops or command, and the Japanese divisions were immediately subordinate to armies. Ollender gives a different appraisal of Japanese strength, maintaining that there were 350,000 men of the standing army and First Reserve, with an additional 850,000 trained men in reserve, creating a total trained force of 1,200,000 men. The breakdown of the Japanese standing army was different too, with Ollender giving each Japanese division 19,000 men including auxiliary troops. He also states that the 13 reserve brigades contained 8,000 men each, and mentions 20 fortress battalions, which is omitted by Conington. It is further stated that the Japanese army possessed 1,080 field guns and between 120 and 150 heavy guns at the war's commencement. Japanese cavalry was not considered the elite of the army, as was the case in Russia. Rather, Japanese cavalry primarily acted as scouts and fought dismounted, armed with carbine and sword, which was reflected in the fact that each cavalry brigade contained 6 machine guns.
Russia. There is no consensus over how many Russian troops were present in the Far East around the time of the commencement of the war. One estimate states that the Russian army possessed 60,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 646 guns, mostly at Vladivostok and Port Arthur, with a portion at Harbin. This was reinforced by the middle of February to 95,000, with 45,000 at Vladivostok, 8,000 at Harbin, 9,000 at Haicheng, 11,000 on the Yalu River, and 22,000 at Port Arthur. A lender gives the figure at 100,000 men, including 8 infantry divisions, fortress troops, and support troops. The entire Russian army in 1904 amounted to 1,200,000 men in 29 corps. The Russian plan was immensely flawed, as the Russians possessed only 24,000 potential reinforcements east of Lake Baikal when the war commenced. They would be reinforced by 35,000 men after 4 months, and a further 60,000 men 10 months after the commencement of the war, at which point they would take the offensive. This plan was based on the erroneous belief that the Japanese army could only mobilize 400,000, with them being unable to field more than 250,000 in an operational sense, and 80,000 to 100,000 of their operational strength being necessary to secure supply lines, and therefore only 150,000 to 170,000 Japanese soldiers would be available for field action. The possibility of Port Arthur being taken was dismissed entirely. An alternative figure for forces in the Far East is given at over 150,000 men and 266 guns, with Vladivostok and Port Arthur containing a combined force of 45,000 men, and with an additional 55,000 engaged in guarding lines of communication, leaving only 50,000 troops to take the field. Unlike the Japanese, the Russians did utilize the corps system and in fact maintained 2 distinct styles of corps, the European and the Siberian. The 2 corps both possessed 2 divisions and their corresponding troop numbers, but a Siberian division was much smaller, containing only 3,400 men and 20 guns, with a corps containing around 12,000 men and lacking both artillery and divisional guns. Russia only possessed 2 Siberian corps, both unprepared for war. After war was declared, this number was raised to 7 as the conflict progressed. The European Corps, in comparison, contained 28,000 soldiers and 112 guns, with 6 such corps sent to the Far East during the war, a further 3 being dispatched that did not arrive before the war ended. Russian logistics were hampered by the fact that the only connection to European Russia was the Trans-Siberian Railway, which remained incomplete as the railway was not connected at Lake Baikal. A single train would take between 15 and 40 days to traverse the railway, with the common figure being closer to 40 days. A single battalion would take a month to transport from Moscow to Shenyang. After the line's eventual completion, 20 trains ran daily, and by the conclusion of the war, some 410,000 soldiers, 93,000 horses, and 1,000 guns had been transported. The tactics utilized by the Russians were outdated. Russian infantry still held to the maxim of Suvorov over a century after his death. The Russian command still used strategies from the Crimean War, attacking in echelon across a wide front in closed formations. It was not uncommon for Russian higher command to bypass their intermediate commanders and issue orders directly to battalions, thus creating confusion during combat.
Ship distribution?
Declaration of War. Japan issued a declaration of war on 8 February 1904. However, 3 hours before Japan's declaration of war was received by the Russian government and without warning, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the Russian Far East Fleet at Port Arthur. Tsar Nicholas II was stunned by news of the attack. He could not believe that Japan would commit an act of war without a formal declaration, and had been assured by his ministers that the Japanese would not fight. When the attack came, according to Cecil Spring Rice, first secretary at the British Embassy, it left the Tsar almost incredulous. The Tsar declared war on Japan 8 days after the attack. Japan, in response, made reference to the Russian attack on Sweden in 1808 without declaration of war, although the requirement to mediate disputes between states before commencing hostilities was made international law in 1899 and again in 1907 with the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. The Principality of Montenegro also declared war on Japan in gratitude for Russia's political support of the Montenegrin prince. The gesture was symbolic, and no soldiers from the army were ever deployed in the Far East, but a few Montenegrins volunteered and joined the Russian army.
Campaign of 1904.
Port Arthur, on the Liaodong Peninsula in the south of Manchuria, had been fortified into a major naval base by the Russian Imperial Army. Since it needed to control the sea in order to fight a war on the Asian mainland, Japan's first military objective was to neutralize the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. Battle of Port Arthur. Main article, Battle of Port Arthur. On the night of 8 February 1904, the Japanese fleet under Admiral Togo Heihachiro opened the war with a surprise torpedo boat destroyer attack on the Russian ships at Port Arthur. The attack heavily damaged the Tsarevich and Retvitsan, the heaviest battleships in Russia's Far Eastern theater, and the 6,600-ton protected cruiser Pallada. These attacks developed into the Battle of Port Arthur the next morning. A series of indecisive naval engagements followed, in which Admiral Togo was unable to attack the Russian fleet successfully as it was protected by the shore batteries of the harbor, and the Russians were reluctant to leave the harbor for the open seas, especially after the death of Admiral Stepan Osipovich Makarov from a naval mine on 13 April 1904. Although the actual Battle of Port Arthur was indecisive, the initial attacks had a devastating psychological effect on Russia, which had been confident about the prospect of war. The Japanese had seized the initiative while the Russians waited in port. These engagements provided cover for a Japanese landing near Incheon in Korea. From Incheon, the Japanese occupied Hansong, and then the rest of Korea. By the end of April, the Japanese Imperial Army under Kuroki Kamemoto was ready to cross the Yalu River into Russian-occupied Manchuria.
Blockade of Port Arthur. The Japanese attempted to deny the Russians use of Port Arthur. During the night of 13-14 February, the Japanese attempted to block the entrance to Port Arthur by sinking several concrete-filled steamers in the deep-water channel to the port, but they sank too deep to be effective. A similar attempt to block the harbor entrance during the night of 3-4 May also failed. In March, the charismatic Vice Admiral Makarov had taken command of the 1st Russian Pacific Squadron with the intention of breaking out of the Port Arthur blockade. On 12 April 1904, 2 Russian pre-dreadnought battleships, the flagship Petropavlovsk and the Pobeda, slipped out of port but struck Japanese mines off Port Arthur. The Petropavlovsk sank almost immediately, while the Pobeda had to be towed back to port for extensive repairs. On 15 April 1904, the Russian government made overtures threatening to seize the British war correspondents who were taking the ship SS Emyon into war zones to report for the London-based Times newspaper, citing concerns about the possibility of the British giving away Russian positions to the Japanese fleet. The Russians quickly learned and soon employed the Japanese tactic of offensive mine-laying. On 15 May 1904, 2 Japanese battleships, the Yashima and the Hatsuse, were lured into a recently laid Russian minefield off Port Arthur, each striking at least 2 mines. The Hatsuse sank within minutes, taking 450 sailors with her, while the Yashima sank while under tow towards Korea for repairs. On 23 June 1904, a breakout attempt by the Russian squadron, now under the command of Admiral Wilhelm Whitgift, failed. By the end of the month, Japanese artillery were firing shells into the harbor.
Siege of Port Arthur. Main article, Siege of Port Arthur. The Siege of Port Arthur commenced in April 1904. Japanese troops tried numerous frontal assaults on the fortified hilltops overlooking the harbor, which were defeated with Japanese casualties in the thousands. With the aid of several batteries of 11-inch L-10 howitzers, the Japanese were eventually able to capture the key hilltop bastion in December 1904. With a spotter at the end of a phone line located at this vantage point, the long-range artillery was able to shell the Russian fleet, which was unable to retaliate against the land-based artillery, invisible over the other side of Hilltop, and was unable or unwilling to sail out against the blockading fleet.
4 Russian battleships and 2 cruisers were sunk in succession, with the 5th and last battleship being forced to scuttle a few weeks later. Thus, all capital ships of the Russian fleet in the Pacific were sunk. This is probably the only example in military history when such a scale of devastation was achieved by land-based artillery against major warships. Meanwhile, attempts to relieve the besieged city by land also failed, and after the Battle of Liaoyang in late August, the northern Russian force that might have been able to relieve Port Arthur retreated to Mukden, Shenyang. Major General Anatoly Stessel, commander of the Port Arthur garrison, believed that the purpose of defending the city was lost after the fleet had been destroyed. In general, the Russian defenders were suffering disproportionate casualties each time the Japanese attacked. In particular, several large underground mines were exploded in late December, resulting in the costly capture of a few more pieces of the defensive line. Stessel, therefore, decided to surrender to the surprised Japanese generals on 2 January 1905. He made his decision without consulting either the other military staff present or the Tsar and military command, all of whom disagreed with the decision. Stessel was convicted by a court-martial in 1908 and sentenced to death on account of an incompetent defense and for disobeying orders. He was later pardoned.
Anglo-Japanese intelligence cooperation. Even before the war, British and Japanese intelligence had cooperated against Russia due to the Anglo-Japanese alliance. During the war, Indian Army stations in Malaya and China often intercepted and read wireless and telegraph traffic relating to the war, which was shared with the Japanese. In their turn, the Japanese shared information about Russia with the British, with one British official writing of the perfect quality of Japanese intelligence. In particular, British and Japanese intelligence gathered much evidence that Germany was supporting Russia in the war as part of a bid to disturb the balance of power in Europe, which led to British officials increasingly perceiving Germany as a threat to the international order. Battle of the Yellow River. In contrast to the Japanese strategy of rapidly gaining ground to control Manchuria, Russian strategy focused on fighting delaying actions to gain time for reinforcements to arrive via the long Trans-Siberian Railway, which was incomplete near Irkutsk at the time. On 1 May 1904, the Battle of Yalu River became the first major land battle of the war. Japanese troops stormed a Russian position led by General Mikhail Zatsulich after crossing the river. The defeat of the Russian Eastern Detachment removed the perception that the Japanese would be an easy enemy, that the war would be short, and that Russia would be the overwhelming victor. This was also the first battle in decades to be an Asian victory over a European power, and marked Russia's inability to match Japan's military prowess. Japanese troops proceeded to land at several points on the Manchurian coast and in a series of engagements drove the Russians back towards Port Arthur. The subsequent battles, including the Battle of Nanchan on 25 May 1904, were marked by heavy Japanese losses, largely from attacking entrenched Russian positions. Battle of the Yellow Sea. With the death of Admiral Stepan Makarov during the siege of Port Arthur in April 1904, Admiral Wilhelm Witt-Geft was appointed commander of the battle fleet and was ordered to make a sortie from Port Arthur and deploy his force to Vladivostok. Flying his flag in the French-built pre-dreadnought Trezarevich, Witt-Geft proceeded to lead his 6 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 14 torpedo boat destroyers into the Yellow Sea in the early morning of 10 August 1904. Waiting for him was Admiral Togo and his fleet of 4 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 18 torpedo boat destroyers. At approximately 12:15, the battleship fleets obtained visual contact with each other, and at 1:30,
With Togo crossing Whitgift's T, they commenced main battery fire at a range of about 8 miles, the longest ever conducted up to that time. For about 30 minutes, the battleships pounded one another until they had closed to less than 4 miles and began to bring their secondary batteries into play. At 6:30 p.m., a hit from one of Togo's battleships struck Whitgift's flagship's bridge, killing him instantly. With the Caesarevich's helm jammed and their admiral killed in action, she turned from her battle line, causing confusion among her fleet. However, Togo was determined to sink the Russian flagship and continued pounding her, but she was saved by the gallant charge of the American-built Russian battleship Retvizan, whose captain successfully drew away Togo's heavy fire from the Russian flagship. Knowing of the impending battle with the battleship reinforcements arriving from Russia, the Baltic Fleet, Togo chose not to risk his battleships by pursuing his enemy as they turned about and headed back into Port Arthur, thus ending naval history's longest-range gunnery duel up to that time and the first modern clash of steel battleship fleets on the high seas.
Baltic Fleet redeploys. Meanwhile, the Russians were preparing to reinforce their Far East fleet by sending the Baltic Fleet, under the command of Admiral Zinoviy-Rozhesvensky. After a false start caused by engine problems and other mishaps, the squadron finally departed on 15 October 1904 and sailed halfway around the world from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific via the Cape route around the Cape of Good Hope in the course of a 7-month odyssey that was to attract worldwide attention. The Dogger Bank incident on 21 October 1904, where the Russian fleet fired on British fishing boats that they mistook for Japanese torpedo boats, nearly sparked a war with the United Kingdom, an ally of Japan, but neutral, unless provoked. The British pressured the French and Portuguese not to let the Russians' fleet in their colonial ports to recoal, forcing the Russians to coal in the open ocean or at anchorages, which was much more inefficient. Being denied docking at ports also exacerbated existing problems in the fleet, such as rotting food supplies, irregular mail delivery, and lack of shore leave. All of these, plus the long voyage, further sapped Russia sailors' health and morale, so for the upcoming battle, they would be facing Japanese sailors who were well rested by contrast. Concerns that the draft of the newer battleships, which had proven to be considerably greater than designed, would prevent their passage through the Suez Canal caused the fleet to separate after leaving Tangiers on November 3, 1904. These concerns, though, may have been an excuse to hide worries over passing through British-controlled waters. The newer battleships and a few cruisers proceeded around the Cape of Good Hope under the command of Rozhesvensky, while the older battleships and lighter cruisers passed through the Suez Canal under the command of Admiral Dmitry Gustavovich von Fockersam. Both sections of the fleet then rendezvoused at Madagascar as planned. Effects on civilians. During the fighting in Manchuria, there were Russian troops that looted and burned some Chinese villages, raped women, and often killed those who resisted or did not understand what they wanted. The Russian justification for all this was that Chinese civilians, being Asian, must have been helping their fellow Asians, the Japanese, inflict defeat on the Russians, and therefore deserved to be punished. The Russian soldiers were gripped by the fear of the Yellow Peril and saw all Asians, not just the Japanese, as the enemy. All of the Russian soldiers were much feared by the Chinese population of Manchuria, but it was the Cossacks whom they feared the most on the account of their brutality and insatiable desire to loot. Largely because of the more disciplined behavior of the Japanese, the Han and Manchu population of Manchuria tended to be pro-Japanese. Russian soldiers also reportedly raped Korean women, for example in the city of Cheongju. The Japanese were also prone to looting, albeit in a considerably less brutal manner than the Russians, and summarily executed any Chinese or Manchu whom they suspected of being spies. The city of Liaoyang had the misfortune to be sacked 3 times within 3 days, first by the Russians, then by the Chinese police, and finally by the Japanese.
The Japanese hired Chinese bandits known variously as the Hunghuzi, or Kunghuzi to engage in guerrilla warfare by attacking Russian supply columns. Only once did the Hunghuzi attack Japanese forces, and that attack was apparently motivated by the Hunghuzi mistaking the Japanese forces for a Russian one. Zhang Zulin, a prominent bandit leader and the future Old Marshal who would rule Manchuria as a warlord between 1916 and 1928, worked as a Hunghuzi for the Japanese. Manchuria was still officially part of the Chinese Empire, and the Chinese civil servants tried their best to be neutral as Russian and Japanese troops marched across Manchuria. In the parts of Manchuria occupied by the Japanese, Tokyo appointed civil governors who worked to improve health, sanitation, and the state of the roads. These activities were also self-interested, as improved roads lessened Japanese logistics problems, while improved health amongst the Chinese lessened the dangers of diseases infecting the Japanese troops. By contrast, the Russians made no effort to improve sanitation or health amongst the Chinese and destroyed everything when they retreated. Many Chinese tended to see the Japanese as the lesser evil.
Campaign of 1905. With the fall of Port Arthur, the Japanese Third Army could continue northward to reinforce positions south of Russian-held Mukden. With the onset of the severe Manchurian winter, there had been no major land engagements since the Battle of Sheho the previous year. The two sides camped opposite each other along 60 to 70 miles, 110 kilometers, of front lines south of Mukden. Battle of Sondapu. The Russian Second Army under General Oskar Griepenberg, between 25 and 29 January, attacked the Japanese left flank near the town of Sondapu, almost breaking through. This caught the Japanese by surprise. However, without support from other Russian units, the attack stalled. Griepenberg was ordered to halt by Kuropatkin, and the battle was inconclusive. The Japanese knew that they needed to destroy the Russian army in Manchuria before Russian reinforcements arrived via the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Battle of Mukden. The Battle of Mukden commenced on 20 February 1905. In the following days, Japanese forces proceeded to assault the right and left flanks of Russian forces surrounding Mukden, along a 50-mile or 80-kilometer front line south of Mukden. Approximately 500,000 men were involved in the fighting. Both sides were well entrenched and were backed by hundreds of artillery pieces. After days of harsh fighting, added pressure from the flanks forced both ends of the Russian defensive line to curve backwards. Seeing they were about to be encircled, the Russians began a general retreat, fighting a series of fierce rearguard actions, which soon deteriorated in the confusion and collapse of Russian forces. On 10th March 1905, after 3 weeks of fighting, General Kuropatkin decided to withdraw to the north of Mukden. The Russians suffered an estimated 90,000 casualties in the battle. The retreating Russian Manchurian army formations disbanded as fighting units, but the Japanese failed to destroy them completely. The Japanese themselves had suffered heavy casualties and were in no condition to pursue. Although the Battle of Mukden was a major defeat for the Russians and was the most decisive land battle ever fought by the Japanese, the final victory still depended on the Navy.
Battle of Tsushima. After a stopover of several weeks at the minor port of Nassau Bay, Madagascar, that had been reluctantly allowed by neutral France in order not to jeopardize its relations with its Russian ally, the Russian Baltic Fleet proceeded to Cam Ranh Bay in French Indochina, passing on its way through the Singapore Strait between 7 and 10 April 1905. The fleet finally reached the Sea of Japan in May 1905. The logistics of such an undertaking in the age of coal power was astounding. The squadron required approximately 500,000 tons of coal to complete the journey, yet by international law, it was not allowed to call at neutral ports, forcing the Russian authorities to acquire a large fleet of colliers to supply the fleet at sea. The weight of the ship's stores needed for such a long journey was to be another major problem. The Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, the renamed Baltic Fleet, sailed 18,000 nautical miles, 33,000 kilometers, to relieve Port Arthur, only to hear the demoralizing news that Port Arthur had fallen while it was still at Madagascar. Admiral Rozhesvinsky's only hope now was to reach the port of Vladivostok. There were 3 routes to Vladivostok, with the shortest and most direct passing through Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan. However, this was also the most dangerous route, as it passed between the Japanese home islands and the Japanese naval bases in Korea. Admiral Togo was aware of Russian progress and understood that, with the fall of Port Arthur, the 2nd and 3rd Pacific Squadrons would try to reach the only other Russian port in the Far East, Vladivostok. Battle plans were laid down, and ships were repaired and refitted to intercept the Russian fleet. The Japanese combined fleet, which had originally consisted of 6 battleships, was now down to 4 battleships and 1 second-class battleship. 2 had been lost to mines, but still retained its cruisers, destroyers, and torpedo boats. The Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron contained 8 battleships, including 4 new battleships of the Borodino class, as well as cruisers, destroyers, and other auxiliaries, for a total of 38 ships. By the end of May, the 2nd Pacific Squadron was on the last leg of its journey to Vladivostok, taking the shorter, riskier route between Korea and Japan and traveling at night to avoid discovery. Unfortunately for the Russians, while in compliance with the rules of war, the 2 trailing hospital ships had continued to burn their lights, which were spotted by the Japanese armed merchant cruiser Sanano Maru. Wireless communication was used to inform Togo's headquarters, where the combined fleet was immediately ordered to sortie. Still receiving reports from scouting forces, the Japanese were able to position their fleet to cross the T of the Russian fleet. The Japanese engaged the Russians in the Tsushima Straits on 27-28 May 1905. The Russian fleet was virtually annihilated, losing 8 battleships, numerous smaller vessels, and more than 5,000 men, while the Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats and 116 men. Only 3 Russian vessels escaped to Vladivostok, while 6 others were interned in neutral ports. After the Battle of Tsushima, a combined Japanese Army and Navy operation, commanded by Admiral Kataoka Shichihiro, occupied Sakhalin Island to force the Russians into suing for peace.
Coming soon, Peace and Aftermath. Assessment, Military Attachés and Observers, Economics, List of Battles, Cultural Legacy, etc. Everyone comments next part and subscribe now, sir.